Hello, Charles.
Hello there, Jason. How are you?
I'm well. Welcome to Wednesday, the day where you close in.
It's a good thing we're doing that today. I mean, we've had the pause that does not refresh between really Friday at around 11 o'clock, 11 p.m. New York time, and the funeral that just finished for George H.W. Bush, which I guess will continue on tomorrow in Texas.
Oh, really?
So we took kind of a brief respite out from administering the pile driver on the Clinton Foundation.
Exactly. Well, and I mean, I'm annoyed. This George Bush death disrupted my mail today, and there was,
Email as well?
well, just mailed from the U.S. Post Office. I went down there expecting something, and nothing arrived.
There you go.
So maybe he could have died on a better day. But, someone suggested to me that he was dead for a while and that they just rolled him out with this convenient timing to screw up that hearing. And I was like, well, we have no evidence of that, but certainly would be, I mean, that guy could have died in 2015 and they were just like Weekend at Bernie's.
No.
I'm kidding.
But on that front, since you bring it up, just before we began the program, we received word that indeed the hearing that had been set for today, 10 a.m., has officially been noticed on the website of the House Subcommittee on Oversight, the subcommittee led by Meadows, I believe. Right. And it's entitled A Case Study on the Clinton Foundation. So I would encourage those in the media in particular to start getting ready to study exactly what might be going on. And if
the study?
Well, if you want to get ready to understand the Clinton Foundation, we did in the last session that we did on Sunday, we put out 15 oldies but goodies that would help you get up to speed quickly on the essence of the Clinton Foundation fraud. And beyond that, we'll get into it in a second, but we don't need to do it right now. There's quite a lot of documentary evidence on your playlist site and elsewhere, which we'll do in a second, for people to get ready to be prepared to ask the kinds of tough questions and have the type of strong articles that should be coming out. As a guess, we have some time before people get mired into the holiday season and abandon all pretense of working. And during that time, I believe sharp pencils or computers or whatever, are going to start drafting incisive pieces about the full extent of this fraud.
It's like that famous saying, Charles, it's better than the poke in the eye with a sharp computer. You don't want that.
Right. Well, before we get into the substance of today's presentation, once again, the art department has gone wild.
Thank you.
And done a great job. Not many people will probably remember It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, which was an interesting movie from, I think, the 60s.
Late 60s. It was shot in VistaVision, of all formats, I believe. And that's a format where the film runs horizontally through the camera and gives a substantially higher resolution image. So this film has recently been repurposed for, I think, IMAX, or certainly 70 millimeter. We've had Quentin Tarantino released his last dreadfully awful film, The Hateful Eight, in VistaVision, I believe, or Panavision Ultra 65, some large format film format. So they restored a lot of 65 millimeter projectors that had been out of service for many, many years. And so the film can be seen in its original high resolution. I remember my brother and I used to watch this movie on Laserdisc, of all formats.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. But to those who might not be able to discern the images there, I mean, who are your personal favorites sprinkled across that globe?
Well, this was a good one because we were able to revisit some of our cartoon caricatures of these public figures. And of course, Charles, parody and utilizing the images of public figures for political commentary, that's First Amendment protected free speech. So anytime we want to mock, Bill Clinton or B-Rock Barry Obama, Dopey James Comey, Jennifer Flowers is included really just to make fun of Bill.
Who's this person?
Well, we've got Anthony Weiner there, of course, without his shirt on, and he's reaching towards Andrew McCabe. Perhaps they might get adjoining cells in prison.
Well, that's about as close as Uma Abedin's gotten to Anthony Weiner without Anthony's shirt on in quite a while.
She's been behind him all the way, so there she is in that normal role. And of course, we've got snarling Dick Cheney, Bob Mueller up there, who's busy, you know, conducting his stupid investigation. We got Tony Podesta. Where's John Podesta? He was in there.
He was over to the right, next to
there he
Barbara
is,
Bush.
there he is. He's wearing the baby's bonnet. I had John Podesta wearing children's clothing.
And you got Vince Foster about to get taken out by somebody, by Mueller.
That's true. Well, this is the police investigating the alleged suicide of Vince Foster right there.
But Mueller's holding a wrench.
Oh, well, you know. Oh, I didn't even notice that about
He's throwing a
the
wrench in the works, as usual.
Exactly. And here we got GW on his father's back, and Hillary, of course, and, you know, Barbara. It's the usual suspects, Charles, you know.
Good.
It's a bad, really bad globalist world. So they're all clawing their way to the top, and I always appreciate your appreciation of the art department. You know, it's become something I think that viewers like to see, and of course we want this message to reach far and wide. So I think, like anything that anybody tries to market, you want to make it enticing, and you want to put something there that causes it to stand out among all the other YouTube videos and Periscope videos and Facebook videos and Twitch and VK.com and DLive and of course Patreon.com. I've got to thank all of our generous Patreon sponsors. Crowdsource The Truth is a viewer-sponsored resource, so I really hope that the people watching will become sponsors by going to patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. It's more important than ever that people do that, but you have, of course, Charles, prepared for us a bevy of information in the form of slides. Perhaps we should get right into that.
Sure.
Without further ado.
Good. So what we're going to do today, we're going to dwell a bit less on the details in the Clinton Foundation and a lot more on this debate over whether unregulated globalism is preferable to nationalism, either principled or unprincipled nationalism. But the one basic theme that we've been trying to build upon, and stepping way back from the minutia of what's the ratio of program service expenses to net revenues in the Clinton Foundation, what's going on here, I would argue, with this special counsel Mueller's collusion witch hunt, is an attempt to distract the easily and readily distracted American and global population from the fact that we've all been fleeced. This experiment that really, we can debate when it started, but I think George Bush had a lot to do, George H.W. Bush, particularly as president, had a lot to do with putting a stamp of approval on the idea that globalism made sense and it's time for we modern folk to migrate away from our pesky adherence to pure national loyalties and instead walk together and build up one great global world with don't look too closely behind the, to your left as the same merry band of people advocating globalism are basically stealing as much money as possible.
Right.
So there really needs to be an in-depth investigation into whether the globalist idea actually worked for anybody but the most connected and crooked insiders. And that to me has been a theme that's troubled me actually ever since 1988, 89 when we first went down the path. Initially, I was really optimistic because I naively thought that America with our might, Europe shaking off statism and shaking off the fact that many of the countries in 1988 were heavily still controlled by government, that we'd move towards this world where the high moral standing and the long tradition, the civilized tradition in the West would overpower corrupt influences in places like India and China and Africa and elsewhere where corruption is endemic. And I think what we've learned is actually corruption's pretty strong. You know, corruption versus the moral approach, corruption tends to work. And it could well be that instead of bringing the world up to a higher moral standard or a higher standard of behavior, the corrupt interests have won, or temporarily won. And it may well be actually that the antidote to corruption would be a revulsion that I think we're seeing from the left and the right, and for people who are apolitical, just saying this stuff just doesn't work. You know, what we've been doing here, yeah, it might have worked before he totally. I don't want to offend the PETA people. You know, apparently you can't use language. Bring home the bacon and stuff like that.
That's offensive to pigs?
Apparently, yes. So I don't want to get in trouble with them, so that's what I'm going to say. This whole globalist thing has basically screwed the pooch.
Oh, I mean, that's offensive to dogs.
I know, that's why I said it. But when you really think about it, and you remember back to what life was like before 1999, let's say, when people in the main were not working 24/7. They weren't checking their smartphones. They could leave work and have the weekend off. And presto change, or maybe by 2002-03 in the United States, broadband connection was so powerful, smartphones were beginning to come to the fore, and suddenly people were more or less working every day of the week. They checked their inboxes in the morning before they went to work. They'd work through the day. They might have multiple devices. And they never stopped to
think. For convenience.
Right, for convenience, exactly, speaking of Hillary. But they never stopped to do the math, that when you're working 5 days a week and suddenly you go to work 7 days a week, when you're working on your vacation, suddenly whatever compensation you get, you need to divide it by a much larger number of hours that you're working. So actually you're making less money, your jobs are less secure, and so for the people who don't save and can't save and will never save, you know, it's in the interest of the globalists to distract them. Why don't you spend more time on Facebook, or spend more time at the movies, or why don't you follow sports? Why don't you do this? Don't worry about, you know, what's really going on. Trust us, we're the experts. Meanwhile, the people behind these globalist schemes, instead of just aspiring to have a commanding market position in one small country like the US, with only 325 million people, suddenly this globalist approach that's not regulated and will never be enforced properly allows entrepreneurs like Zuckerberg and the Twitter people and others.
What about Tim Cook? He had some choice words.
And Tim Cook and others to instantly build out global footprints, or at least much larger businesses, which by definition will have faster growth rates in expected growth rates in revenue and cash flow, et cetera, so they'll command much higher valuations. And suddenly the world became a lot less equal as a result of globalism. You know, think about it. Zuckerman was basically in college, barely in college, and today he's one of the richest people in the world. And you go down the list of people who in the high-tech land who have made it to the top, whether it's Bill Gates, Zuckerberg, a lot of other people, Larry Ellison, they've gone for a moonshot compared to what the standard, or Jeff Bezos, the standard person who, let's say, graduates from high school, goes to a state college, finds a decent job by some luck, or, you know, hook or crook today, that person is not going to be a billionaire. Well, that person may never even have $500,000, let alone $100,000.
$100,000, right?
Right. They may spend their entire lives paying down student debts.
Meanwhile, that mother Zucker is running for president maybe in 2020 or 2024.
I think like Avenatti, I think he's going to discover that won't work.
I love that letter Avenatti put out. I think I should announce that I'm also not going to run for president.
Or you could form an exploratory committee.
It's just so stupid to put out a letter. That's like when Oprah Winfrey had a press conference to announce that she's not gay. And I was like, wait a minute, I wasn't even thinking about that before you said it.
Right.
It's just a pointless press conference, in my view.
So what I thought was, there I believe is going to be a torrent of news in the next week on the Clinton Foundation, and rather than dwell on that, we've already done a tremendous amount of stuff on that. I thought this would be a good moment to just take a pause back and think about how is globalism, unregulated globalism, working for you, the audience? How's it working for some of these big, well-known names? What are the facts? What's an easy way to lay this out for you? And that today is what we're going to do.
Before we get into that, Charles, I just wanted to comment on something I brought up on Sunday's show, we were looking at a photograph of H.W. Bush, well, someone who has
An uncanny resemblance.
an uncanny resemblance in what is admittedly a low-resolution photograph that would place H.W. in Dealey Plaza on the day of the JFK assassination. I admit that may not have been him. There's other evidence that puts George H.W. Bush, if not physically close, certainly operationally close to the JFK assassination. I don't know if you've seen this photograph before. Have you ever seen this before?
No, I don't think so.
Well, it's Richard Nixon, very young Richard Nixon. I believe this photograph is from 1947. And this is Richard Nixon, this is Prescott Bush, and this is Jack Ruby. And Richard Nixon, of course, famously said when Ruby shot Lee Harvey Oswald on television, he leapt up and said, "I know that guy," which, why the hell would you say that? But, you know, here he is pictured with him. Prescott Bush, of course, also a globalist, laundered money for the Nazis through the Union Bank of Switzerland. So I think this globalism is a family affair, as we've discussed in the past, and I think it goes back well before 1988, if I had to take a guess.
All right.
But I thought I'd bring that to your attention before we dig into the slides.
Good. So maybe we just jump, yeah. So for our new, your new viewers, I understand you're not even going up now by tens anymore or hundreds. You're just going like 1,000 every other day, right?
Well, there were some really good videos last week, and I'm sure you recall, Charles, there were those people around the internet who had predicted my demise, even went as far as telling people that I'm crashing and burning, and that's why nobody wants to be on the show anymore, and that you would soon be leaving, and everybody would soon be leaving, and all these terrible things were going to happen. But yeah, we've crossed over 75,000 subscribers on the main Jason Goodman YouTube channel, which of course is the original home of Crowdsource the Truth. We've also got Crowdsource the Truth 2, which has got 9,000 plus subscribers. Patreon.com/Crowdsource the Truth has over 1,100 subscribers. We've actually taken a little dip down on Patreon, but that's pretty normal. Month over month, it goes up, it goes down. Definitely want to see more people on there. The playlist is growing, Charles. Today is the 124th show that we've done. If people haven't seen this excellent Terminate Her episode,
Yeah.
I hope people will watch that. That was definitely...
I must confess, I've watched that opening about 10 times.
That's
It
good.
was pretty
I'm glad.
funny. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. But people who want to get all the information, as you said, prior to the hearing next week, they can just come to this playlist, which has, the playlist itself has been accessed over 14,000 times. And I think you calculated there's more than 2 million individual video views for videos within the Sunday with Charles and Charles Ortel is Closing In series. So that's quite a lot, Charles. I often think about how just a few years ago, if you wanted to have 2 million people view something that you did,
Wasn't so easy.
no.
And there's a couple of noteworthy things, or more than a couple, but one of them is that the average length here of I'd say the most recent 100 is over 2 hours.
We don't even want to talk about the width.
And the width is all the same. And I believe you told me, didn't you, that most movies are by design like 1 hour and 33 minutes or something?
Yeah, I think
like
92 minutes is sort of the minimum
92 minutes.
for a feature film.
Right. So here we're chunking out 2 a week. We're getting our viewers to watch these things for many, many views. Typically within the first 24 hours, we're getting many, many views. And you had mentioned, perhaps we should go to the playlist just for a second,
Sure.
this idea of some kind of a coffee table book. And what I think will be interesting with that, Jason, is that what will be particularly interesting is to go back as events unfold, and I believe they're going to unfold very rapidly in the next several weeks here and months. It'll be really interesting to go back and look at some of the choice videos that we've done and the choice images that we've done, and compare what we were talking about on a given date and then what transpired and why we did it a certain way and how come the authorities didn't move more quickly to attack these things. And so we do a little bit of a told you so stuff, but how you can learn from what we saw and how this is a very significant and potentially interesting case. We've got a lot of information in here, and a lot of people, particularly if we get in a very lucky zone, and this will take a large amount of luck, and I'm sorry to say it this way, but it's the way I think about it. The lucky zone where GE goes bankrupt and the Clinton Foundation does get put into conservatorship. Then what's going to happen is people around the world are going to say, wait a minute.
Wait, what does that mean for people like me who don't know what conservatorship is?
So when you set up a charity, you're doing so in Little Rock. It's supposed to be an independent entity. And the trustees of that charity, and the Clinton Foundation, though they don't want to admit it, has only actually legally had trustees who have higher duties of loyalty, care, following the law. And
they can't be bothered with that, Charles.
Right. So you have to do all that. And when the Attorney General of a state where you're registered makes a determination that you're not doing that the trustees are incapable of conserving the true interests of the charity, they walk in the front door and they say, trustees, you're out. We're appointing a conservator to figure out what really happened here. And that conservator, as in the case of Madoff, will have the right to go back and figure out what actually happened to this charity, who's responsible, who was harmed, and then the conservator will do whatever that conservator can do within the boundaries of the law to work with authorities to hold those malefactors responsible. And so we could have a scenario here where one or both of those events happen in quick succession, in which event people around the world would be attracted to this playlist, and they're going to go and they're going to be watching. You'll have all kinds of people watching it, trying to figure out how in the hell did Jason and Charles see this and spend so much time on this, and why don't we move more quickly? And there'll be a lot of hand-wringing about, why did it take 124 videos? And various and sundry other people. And hats off actually to Peter Schweitzer, who banged the drum in his book, Clinton Cash, well before I was, or you or I were as close to getting this much in depth on the project. So,
well, I think the answer is quite clear. I mean, Matthew Whitaker obviously had this amazing Terminator opening on loop on his computer, and he has been unable to pull himself away to conduct the investigation. That would have been funnier if the thing would actually play when I click it. There we go. But we remember, of course, Hillary is sitting atop the...
That really is, it's...
I know you like to see that, so
I
there
do.
we go.
Well done. Well, and the sound was great too.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charles.
So just quickly on the approach, I was talking to one of my brothers today about this and the whole project, and our father, that is to say my brother and my father, makes the point about the internet that it's one thing to use the internet to just lower your costs, and that's a garden variety thing. You're not doing anything all that special. People are always trying to lower costs. It's another thing to use the internet to do something very different, to give the audience and the crowd and others the ability to engage in ways that was heretofore not possible. And it's really thanks to your reaching out, Jason, and our reaching out to members of the audience and their contributions, both financial to you and also, and more important, even more important, with ideas and work and constructive suggestions. We've now got a band of people, not all 75,000 are active, and there are some silent people who choose not to subscribe who are helpful. We've got a large group of people who is coming in, and I think will be very successful, particularly in the news flow that's due out momentarily, raising the consciousness, to putting some spine behind these politicians in Washington who have gotten very comfortable with the idea, Washington's a special place and the laws don't really apply to us. And if the President of the United States just wants to break the law, it's okay, we'll let him do that, because then we got to chit on that president and we can use that as leverage, and that's how you get a Comey and a Mueller and a corrupt FBI and probably going way, and a Brennan and a Clapper and all these NSA operations. There's that's the way that people in DC would like to think, because that's a very,
swamp-friendly attitude.
Right, exactly, a grime-covered swamp. But on the other hand, those of us who live outside DC and actually don't enjoy going to DC and wake up in the morning and want to make sure that ideally we earn more revenue than we spend, and we put some money aside to take care of ourselves and our families for the long term. Those type of people, and that's the overwhelming majority of Americans, don't cotton all that well to, oh, well, yeah, he's president, why don't we just, even in Reagan's case, and I love Ronald Reagan, I thought it was a massive mistake for the insiders who liked Ronald Reagan to say, you've done a great job, Ronnie, you probably have millions of dollars anyway, but why don't we're going to give you a house in Bel Air.
Did they do that?
They did, and we're just as a gift. And then beyond that, we're going to arrange for you at the height of Japan's folly in 1989 to go give speeches in Japan where he was paid millions of dollars. That was a bad move and a bad precedent because it frankly signaled that our politicians can be purchased very inexpensively. And it should not, politicians should be, their compensation should be set at a level where, going to be president or senator or House of Representatives is not a financial burden, nor is it a way to become a billionaire. You do it, you should have a reasonable amount of time to do it. Presidents are limited to 8 years. I think Congress people and House people should be limited as well. More importantly, staffers should be limited. There should not be these people working in various staffs for 40 years and thinking they're more important than the elected officials. So I bring all this up just to say that it's you in the crowd who can do immeasurable positive things now. Making sure you tweet out those of these videos that you like the most to people who are important. I'm seeing a lot of increase in my Twitter traffic back and forth. People are taking this stuff seriously. And for those of you who are new, just joining for this first time, what we try to do here is we are, to a certain extent, analyzing, and maybe today we'll do a little bit more lecturing than normal, but what we're trying to do is give you the tools to analyze and understand what we're saying yourself. So we don't just, like Brian Williams on MSNBC, who just doesn't even give you the benefit of a transcript, really, of what he's saying.
Isn't it just made up anyway?
It is made up anyway, and you just want to burn it, probably to light fires as it gets colder.
Oh, actually, you remind me, Charles, and this goes to what you're saying about the members of the Crowdsource community. I received this lovely image of someone who actually took our advice.
Oh, really? That's an actual burning of the, wow.
Yeah, starting the Christmas Yule log early and using the Wall Street Journal as kindling. So really getting their money's worth out of the Wall Street Journal. I think how much is one copy of the Wall Street Journal?
It's ridiculous, $5.
5 for one.
Yeah, cool. Well, they're trying to drive you away from buying them.
Any actual news.
Right.
Charles, people can pay $2 a month and watch Crowdsource the Truth on patreon.com/Crowdsource the Truth.
And you'll have no negative impact on the environment.
That's exactly right. You don't need to roll it up and put it in the fireplace. But it looks like you won't need to chain yourself to Twitter in a Laura Loomer style protest, because you seem to be tweeting in a rather unfettered, currently unfettered. You're back on the rise here with 33.8 thousand viewers, and people can follow you there at Charles Ortel, so that's very good. And of course, my Twitter is at CS The Truth. It's a good way for people to stay in touch with both of us in case any of these platforms get taken out. There'll be some kind of notification there on Twitter. And of course, from the Crowdsource the Truth Twitter page, people can get right to the Periscope broadcasts, which are the same as what we've got here on YouTube and some of the other platforms. So trying to be on as many platforms as possible so that they'll have to collude with one another, as they did in the case of eliminating Alex Jones.
Well, and that is you make a great point there, that when we cite these figures of viewership, it's just for one YouTube channel that we're talking about. And we haven't yet gone through for 124 videos to figure out, okay, how many in the main channel, how many in the second channel, how many in the third, fourth, fifth, what does it add up to? I don't even know how you do that on Facebook, whether they give you...
Yeah,
they
tell you. Yep.
Really?
We're more popular on YouTube than Facebook, but there are plenty of viewers on Facebook. I want to welcome everybody who's watching on every platform. And also we have this great multi-chat application, which is on some shows difficult for me to keep up with because I'm changing the graphics and doing all kinds of stuff. But look at all the active chatters we have right here, Charles. According to this right now, we've got 933 viewers.
Well done, well done. And we're about to compete with Brett Baer. So I suppose we could perhaps go to the third slide.
Did we give the disclaimer?
We did not. There it is. So yeah, I think I sort of alluded to it, that this is based on publicly available information. Of course, the analysis that we do is using as a primary resource this information. We try to point you to all this information that's out there. And today's discussion is interesting because the language that economists use to examine whether or not there's economic progress, globalism makes sense, I would argue that that language is fatally flawed, right? If you're going to talk about a subject, but the language is not precise enough to really get into what was going on, you're going to come up with the wrong conclusions. And so we're going to take you through it. It's going to seem a little, there are a lot of numbers in this, but I've tried to make it simple. This will seem a little bit tough for people who are not involved with economics and finance, but we're going to show you just how flawed globalism is and why it makes a lot more sense, particularly for people living in the United States of America, to look at our country, let Europe embrace Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel and their foolish walk back into some crazy statist approach of trying to compete with us, because it's not going to work for them, as the riots in France bear out, and as the fact that Merkel is going to likely have to be leaving power given her performance in various by-elections in that country. Let them do all that. We're going to show you how the proper way to think about pluses and minuses of each important market.
Perhaps they should replace Merkel with Urkel.
I think we had that, didn't we?
Spoken about before, exactly.
Yeah, we had Urkel, 2009 to 2017. So this is interesting. This came up, Jason, the first link here. We were gearing up. John Solomon had teased on Friday night last week that there was going to be some big developments. Then I just saw this story here with, I'm not even sure what the Epoch Times is. I think it's connected to China somehow. But this has an infographic on, it's pretty interesting for you like these kind of things. I mean, look at this thing. Somebody put a lot of work into the various and sundry relationships of questionable people, and I'm going to look at this in some considerable depth. It just came out. But people are beginning to tease out these questionable relationships among Clinton Foundation donors, governments, grifters, and the Clintons. But I guess I repeat myself.
Yeah, a little redundant.
Yeah. And so there's going to be a lot of case studies as you follow these various connections, and you come to realize that a lot of the connections are self-reinforcing. We're going to begin to grow to understand that the Clinton Foundation and the Blair Foundation and the Obama Foundation and all these dynastic political families that create foundations are using them, I would argue, as clearinghouses, as not so subtly disguised ways to route tribute to these people and hope that, you know, either when they're out of power but they have friends still in power, or when they're heading towards another election, you stay on their wrong side and you stay off their you stay on the right side and you stay off the wrong side.
We should make a clearinghouse like one of those things with Ed McMahon with a giant check, and it could say $1 billion.
Exactly. But the second link, here Rand Paul, and I'm growing to like Rand Paul more and more, just came up yesterday, I guess, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Gina Haspel, the CIA director, came in, gave a briefing to the Senate, and suddenly the Senate is all up in arms again about MBS, and that maybe he did indeed order the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And I got to say, looking at all this, who benefits from this argument? It's Iran. It's people who were pro the Iran deal who are upset with Trump for tearing up the Iran deal. It's Turkey. There are a lot of people who benefit from this, and a lot of people who are harmed by it. And you know, I love the way the people in Congress, they don't remember 2003. You know, when weapons of mass destruction, who brought that to us? It was the CIA. They were 100% convinced, weapons of mass destruction, yada, yada. And then they've spent, since about 2004, they've spent 14, 15 years decrying the CIA's conclusions. Now, because this is something that suits the pro-Iran camp or whatever, suddenly, oh yeah, we love the CIA. We're totally on side with this. This makes a bunch of sense. And I think Rand Paul and others need to step into the 2018, 2019 and say, look, when the CIA was proposed back and adopted in 1949, maybe it made sense and maybe it didn't make sense. But in 2018 and 2019, 17 national security agencies that we know about, and who knows how many that we don't know about, none of which are regulated, with gigantic black budgets, and a track record from 49 to the present that is abysmal. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not as if, we can say, well, the United States doesn't have military personnel all over the world engaged in battles all over, because we do. It's not as if we can say that, we're only spending $50 billion a year on the military, because we're not. We're spending over $700 billion. It's not as if we could say, many people, and so obviously it's horrible to be killed, but it's even worse to go into these battles and to be either physically or emotionally scarred, or worse, both. And we have, these willy-nilly escapades we've been having in places that are not thought through properly. We're still in Afghanistan, and in the press recently, official organs of the state are saying we're at a stalemate in Afghanistan, this after 17 years of fighting. We got into World War II and out of World War II in 4 years. With, our country was a lot smaller. That was a multi-campaign fight. When we got into it, our defense industry was basically not non-existent, but it was much smaller than it needed to be. Somehow we managed to play a vital role in winning World War II in 4 years, decisively in Europe and in Asia. But why is it that we're still fighting in Afghanistan 17 years later? And why is it that when you look at Iraq, they're almost taking off their shoes like they did and throw them at George W. That's what they're doing in Iraq,
When they did that, I love that.
Yeah.
Charles, you speak of official state organs. Speaking of organs, you think if Jamal Khashoggi worked for the Clintons and was found chopped up, they'd probably say it was suicide.
Exactly, right.
So that's curious that it's a murder all of a sudden.
Yeah. And then by the same token, we think about what we get out of the UN and the EU, and I call them kleptocrats, not bureaucrats. There isn't, if we look at this climate depot link, now we've got to urgently fix the climate threat. Now, we're not sure whether the climate is getting hotter or colder or moving sideways or who's responsible, but nonetheless, what they now want you to do is make sure that you drop everything, pay a gigantic tax into, guess what? I believe the UN tax on climate, if it comes forward, who's going to collect that? That leaky bucket Unitate, which was so well run that it managed to give 50% of its grants to the Clinton Foundation HIV/AIDS initiative that didn't actually exist for many, many years, an amount that came from Unitate to the Clinton Foundation of $650 million. Do we really think, in this day and age, that it makes sense to send trillions of dollars over time into a collection of people who are addicted to caviar and wine and catering parties and who knows what else? We won't get into the sordid things they might be addicted to. To have yet another bureaucracy administer yet another plan that likely won't have one rat's ass difference in whether the planet gets warmer or colder. And here we have this crowd was saying, oh no, it's going to heat. Go back to the dire projections. We were supposed to there'd be palm trees in Manhattan. Have water that would
be nice.
Well, water towering over the island. You'd have to live in New Jersey. That wouldn't be so nice.
That would be not good.
Except
what about Serco, Charles? Have you heard about this company, Serco?
You told me about it, yeah.
But because David Hawkins, I think, said that the carbon credits are paid to them. Like, why is Unitate? Because that's the Paris Climate Accord or something?
It's just the UN bureaucrats got together and said, we have a slush fund we've got working already. Why not put some more money into it? Come on in, the water's fine.
Because David's done pretty good study of how this carbon credit market is really just a financial sham, and that carbon dioxide is a wholly beneficial fertilizer gas, that the answer to too much carbon dioxide is plant more trees.
Right, exactly.
Or put more, seaweed in the ocean or something like that.
Yeah, again, I mean, it's time for these people who model problems and then come up with solutions and don't disclose that the solution, like Al Gore, the solution typically to a problem they assert is to send a whole bunch of money towards an entity that will have kickbacks to Al Gore or other people, or Michael Moore or the others. So I think the way we should be looking at these problems is the world, if we want to think globally, the world has way too much debt. Where is that debt concentrated? Well, places like the United States, China, and Japan have piled up massive debts in Europe. Instead of focusing on creating a gigantic new bureaucracy that will hobble the United States and Europe in competition with rising nations like China and India, what we in the United States should care about is paying down our debt so that we do not leave to our children and grandchildren a country that has so much debt on it that in a crisis of dollar confidence, we could find ourselves like Venezuela. That's something that's really important. You know, because if we're completely bankrupt, if Venezuela's out there and people are, you know, in a state where the wives are in prostitution or leaving the country, you know, they used to be a very rich country, very well done. It's a basket case now with 150% per annum or higher inflation. It's got no credit. It's a large population. We don't want to be Venezuela. And before we start investing ourselves, we're already taking care of the world militarily, trying to keep peace militarily with only 325 million out of 7.5 billion people. You know, let's get our own financial house in order first. And let's not, you know, rush into some kookaburra scheme. We have to pick on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I mean, she's going around saying that we of course we can afford Medicare for all. That's only $32 trillion. We spent $21 trillion on the military. No, we didn't.
It's $32 trillion?
It's absurd. We're going to show you why those numbers are absurd in a second. These are people who have no clue what anything costs. Kind of like, remember all the fun that was made of George Bush when he went through a Walmart or something,
yeah,
and there was a
cash.
cash.
What the price scanner was.
He didn't know what that is. I mean, similarly, this Ocasio-Cortez doesn't have a clue what anything costs. I mean, you can't say, yeah, let's do a $32 trillion deal. We only spend $6 trillion in total on government.
I think she doesn't know much of anything.
That's right. So, and then we get, this is this Fox News thing. You know, I know David Attenborough makes great movies, or maybe Summer Bombs, and he's got an English accent, so people think he's smart. But you know, every time these people get together and they talk about, you know, woe is me, the sky is falling. You know, and you listen, of course, I'm sure the video on it was fantastic, and the pageantry at the summit was great, the food was probably good, the drinks were unlimited, probably the top shelf wine and beer. No beer. Top shelf wine and scotch.
I thought he was dead.
I don't think so. Maybe it's a hologram of him.
Yeah, no,
But
can't be, Charles.
But anyway, so, and this is Fox News. Oh, this is in Poland. Yeah, he's not dead, unless he died in the last 24 hours.
Well, maybe it's his brother, the guy who was in Jurassic Park, is dead.
Oh, did he have a brother named Attenborough?
Didn't he?
I don't know. There he is, in the pink, David Attenborough.
Richard Attenborough, who's that?
That must have been his brother. But anyway, so, who's still dead, I guess. So the point here is, you know, you can excite a lot of controversy asserting that there's this global problem that needs to be solved by the UN because it's so good at solving problems. Now let's think through the problems the UN has solved. That would be none. You know, let's think through, you know, the amount of money that the UN has wasted, the number of UN bureaucrats. I mean, you think to the trouble spots where UN armies have gone in Africa, Haiti, and elsewhere, raping little kids, and you know, the UN is an advertisement for unregulated globalism. It's everything that's wrong with unregulated globalism. That's the UN.
Yeah, weren't there UN workers implicated in exactly that? Right?
Absolutely, they're regularly. Anytime
Whatever
there's a
happened with that?
Nothing, because it's unregulated.
Wow.
So
That's terrible.
we go back into the slides there. We have this ABC News article, which was basically, you know, breathlessly touting the fact that the various memos that are going to come out in this week are going to show, in a nutshell, just how serious Mueller's probe is, because there's going to be text about what he's holding in reserve and who's cooperating and why, and this, people were fulminating before what happened next. Oh yeah, the sky's falling on Trump too.
Sapporo Reserve is what he's holding in reserve.
That's right, exactly.
The video doesn't seem to want to play there.
Shortly after this thing came out, the following story, the following link, was out late yesterday around 9 p.m. And Greg Jarrett had a piece out. I don't know, it doesn't say what time there, but he was called in to Sean Hannity to say it's just one big nothing burger. And we had various and sundry people on Hannity last night. Mark Penn, who's a Democrat, was a Clinton supporter, basically saying, their quick take of this memo that came out is has nothing to do with collusion before the election. It deals with what happened. It deals primarily with what happened with Flynn in the transition period between the election and the inauguration, and whether he may have been having meetings with the Russians and others, and whether he was truthful about those meetings. And my gosh, when you think through the challenges, and go back to any transition, go back to Barack Obama's transition. I remember reading stories in that period between the election and the inauguration in 2008 and 9, November 2008, January 2000. I remember all these wonderful stories admiring the Obama administration for reaching out to governments around the world. Meanwhile, Barack Obama and Valerie Jarrett were under investigation by the FBI, under quote investigation led by Robert Mueller, for what may have happened in terms of selling Obama's Senate seat.
Oh yeah, right.
Right.
Blagojevich.
And were there any hearings about that? Of course not. No.
Didn't they stick Blagojevich in jail?
He's still there. He's still there. So I don't know if we can get back to the slides. Yeah. Now, what will happen? This is a story that's incendiary, and they've been pounding it. What's going to happen now through the end of the year, beyond the Clinton Foundation and related dramas, is this whole issue, which Democrats and frankly people in Congress, Paul Ryan, have been reluctant to do this very simple analysis. What percentage of non-citizen households are on welfare? Now, this is an article which may or may not be true, which alleges a very high percentage. 63% of households headed by non-citizens are on some form of welfare. 63%. And
what is this Center for Immigration Studies?
It's probably got it probably has a dog in the hunt. It's probably negative on, it probably wants the wall. It's probably, it may be biased. But the point is, what is the real number? What is the real number here? And how many nations do we know of that say, I don't think in Mexico you can go to Mexico as a non-citizen and start getting welfare that easily. I know that in many countries, you actually have to prove that you're financially responsible before you go and travel to them. Saudi Arabia happens to be one of them that I know, where you have to, no matter how wealthy you are, you have to get a sponsor to make sure that, should you go into the country and make the mistake of welching on a bill without understanding that when you steal, they cut your hand off. Nonetheless, it's not enough they're going to get your hand, they want to get the bill paid, so they've got to have a financial sponsor. I mean, so I don't know if the right number is 63%, but I do know, thinking about people who are already citizens in this country, particularly disadvantaged citizens living in ghettos, and there still are ghettos. Sadly, now in rich cities, the ghettos are getting bigger. Those people who are already American citizens deserve whatever financial assistance we can provide to them before we start saying, oh yeah, come on in.
And get money. Yeah. When I was in Los Angeles, I was staying in downtown Los Angeles last time near the Patreon convention, and I'll tell you, Charles, that was dangerous. I mean, entire streets filled with tents, obviously desperate people walking around, and I was in the wrong neighborhood to be walking at night.
Yeah. Well, really the point there is that we have we are an attractive country. The people who like to play by the rules follow the rules, which require making an application, waiting patiently to get considered, answering the questions, getting a temporary residence permit, and then seeing that you're a good citizen, becoming a permanent resident and a full-time citizen. There are many people in that line. The number's in the millions. So we shouldn't be saying, it's not generous to say to people, oh, forget the rules. we want people who don't play by the rules to come into this country, jump over a wall, cheat, come here on a vacation.
Bum rush the border.
Come here on vacation, overstay your visa. We don't want to encourage, at least I don't think we should want to encourage those type of people to come into this country, given that we have issues surrounding people who are, in the bottom 20%, 30% of this country who need our help and support.
Well, furthermore, for strictly selfish reasons, I think it's in everybody's best interest to help people in financial desperation and reduce the odds that someone who's not financially desperate might get stabbed walking through the streets of Los Angeles or elsewhere.
Right, exactly.
So
exactly.
It's, something to think about.
So we also have heard, this is encouraging, this Market Watch link here. Remember, we've talked in the past about the Panama Papers case.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a case.
Mossack Fonseca, what's
Right.
the name of that?
Well, apparently, yesterday, people are beginning to be charged in that case. And we won't reveal the last name of the person, but Kevin has been sending me, our accountant friend Kevin has been sending me every day press releases that are quite encouraging coming out of the Justice Department, that the Trump Justice Department has actually decided that fraud is a thing that might be enforced, and it might be a good idea to drop hammers on fraudsters. And so there was a lot of information that came out of this Panama Papers drop, and I've got to believe one interesting set of questions about it is how much did the Obama and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations know about what was going on involving Americans and these Panama Papers and other offshore location abuses, how much they know about it, and why is it taking so long to do something about it. But it's gratifying to see that something indeed is finally being done, because it's through these type of organizations and structures that politicians and crooked businessmen operate to provide, in effect, bribes that are difficult to understand.
And even locate.
Exactly. Now, here's one negative on George W., and I'm just from the standpoint, I don't believe that it's, like Dave, the guy's being buried, you don't necessarily jump all over him. But on the other hand, there's been nothing but nonstop praise coming out of the mainstream media. And this is a piece that appeared today around 12:20 that, let's just understand that in the tenure, going back before he was vice president, really for his long career in national office, the world has been at war. Now maybe you could try to make the case when my kids were young, they'd make the case I'd walk into the playroom and there'd be toys everywhere that you could possibly imagine in places you didn't want to imagine. And then they look up at me and say, Dad, we've been cleaning it up. We've been cleaning this up for hours. It's a lot worse before we got here. That's the kind of argument we get here with HW. Well, if I hadn't been focused on this, and if I hadn't participated, Doug Schoen was the pundit was giving HW great praise for when he was being president. That the Central European situation, transition from communism to the West, Soviet Union transition away from the Soviet Union to Russian Federation. These were positive things. And when you talk to people in the former Soviet Union, that's not the way they look at it. They look at it that under first HW and then Bill Clinton, that a whole bunch of oligarchs, politically connected, in some cases thugs, basically used their connections to get sweetheart deals, to buy companies at unrealistically low prices, financed by Westerners, many of them American, in structures where politicians might have gotten paid off. This is a record that really needs to be examined closely, and not particularly on the day of George H.W. Bush's funeral. I don't know if you remember Dana Carvey's, maybe people on this audience don't remember Dana Carvey's wind-ups of many people. I guess he did a great one of H.W.
Yeah.
And also a good one of W. But
I was a little bit, for a while, I was kind of friends with Dana Carvey's brother.
Uh-huh. And what does he do?
He is a video hardware engineer and was involved in the development of some early desktop video stuff. And I came to know him actually through the same channels as how I know Lee Stranahan.
Oh, okay. So anyway, some of these old Dana Carvey bits are very, very funny. And he does Carvey manages to do a remarkable impression of H.W., and this is sort of a poignant little fun piece. You can, with a video that people can watch if they want to. So we go back to the slides.
It's not much funny about H.W. Bush, but
then this one here is this American Mirror. This is a drudge-length story. Apparently, at the funeral, the Clintons couldn't bring themselves to be civil to Donald Trump. They were all in the same pew or whatever at the National Cathedral. And whereas the Obamas and W were very friendly to Trump, you know, Hillary did the old icy stare, and Bill, of course.
It's not loading. There we go.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they've got to be concerned that the hammer is about to drop on them, and I think B-Rock should be worried about that a little bit too.
Yeah, I think. Well, I hope he is. I hope they both. Here, you know, shaking hands, Melania talking to Trump, Michelle shaking, and then Bill not reaching out, and Hillary looking away.
Trump kind of ignored them too.
Yeah, and I wonder what's in that big sheaf of papers that Bill and Hillary have. Probably it's the looming indictment.
What's Joe Biden doing? He's looking around for young girls to grow.
So if we go to the next page, we'll get into some.
Oh, look at that. It actually even brought up the next video, Creepy Uncle Joe.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Okay, so now there's been a school of thought. I've heard through the grapevine that people are saying that while you and I have been on the warpath here about the Clinton Foundation, we don't understand that there's really been a precedent where former presidents, you get out of office, you've been serving the country, you have your presidential foundation, you get some latitude as former president because there are only going to be a few of these presidential foundations, and we shouldn't be all into the nitty-gritty about forcing a presidential foundation to actually do what it's supposed to do.
To not steal money.
Right, to not steal money, to hold the actual presidential records and not bleach bit them, and to make them available so that scholars in all parties can look at them and not just, diss anybody who might want to take a critical eye at the Clintons. And here's a CNN story, so it's probably wrong, saying that he defended, I don't know what's going on there, but in the CNN story, which is March 7th, 2015, 9 days before I wrote the first piece that I wrote about the Clinton Foundation on the 16th of March, basically saying that, our foundation, it's okay that we take money from foreign countries because, in essence, we've done more good than harm. And at this point, I'd been studying the Clinton Foundation for a few weeks, and I said, wait a minute, that's not the standard, that you've got to do more good than harm, That's not at all the standard. So if you go back into the slide, that caused me to remember this guy, Neil Borofsky, and we have a link to his book. And Neil was a guy, he was called the SIG TARP. He was the person who was this Inspector General of TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. I mean, he's a very accomplished person. This is the Kindle version of his book.
Wow, why is it so cheap on hardcover?
Much more. Well, many used books are cheap.
I've been finding it quite interesting. The guest that Ole and I had this morning on our show that appears only on Patreon, her book was like $299 because it's out of print, and there seems to be, look, Scott Bennett, his book, if you don't buy it from his website, is like $100 or something, because it's sort of like a soft censorship that they do. They make the book so expensive that nobody's going to buy it.
That's weird.
And that one's cheap, so obviously there's something in there that somebody wants you to read.
Well, so if we go back to the slide itself, what it does, I remember this book because I read it carefully. I'm going to leave out the name of the Washington Power Broker and Insider. But Neil, when he started on his job to try to figure out, who might be worthy of being punished in the financial crisis, in the end, very few people concerning the crisis of 2007 to 9 have actually gone to prison. There have been firms that paid large fines, but the malefactors, the actual human beings who got these companies into trouble, and who may have walked away with hundreds of millions or not more than that, they weren't actually punished. And here he relates this thing, the longer version is that he goes and he meets this person at a bar, and the person...
Was it Alexander Downer?
I'm not going to say, no, it wasn't, no. I don't want to say who it was.
Papadopoulos?
But this person basically is taking him aside in the beginning, saying, look, thanks for coming down here, you've got a bright future, kid, but you're really hurting yourself, because he'd already started rattling cages. And so he asks, well, how? And the guy said, well, have you thought about what you'll be doing next? You have to think about it. I'm telling you, you're doing yourself real harm. Out there in the market, there are consequences for some of the things you're saying and the way that you're saying them. In other words, you don't want to go there. If you rattle the cages in Washington, D.C., we insiders are going to make sure you never work again. And so this book came out in 2012, and I recall, I had been at that point 5 years into a process of exposing GE, and still, GM in 2012 was being touted as something that had been rescued. I don't think it was actually rescued for the benefit of American workers, and it certainly set a horrible precedent in the way they treated creditors. But I noticed this, and in talking today about globalism, I thought that we should have this in the back of our minds. People who want to holler about the fact that no one's been brought to justice should read Neil's book, and Neil may be somebody who comes back to the fore, depending on how President Trump how seriously he may take this issue of bringing unregulated globalism to heel, of stopping to fund it the way we fund it with billions and tens of billions of dollars of contributions around the world to these schemes. Maybe it's time to really enforce the rules and make the American investment market great again. So if we go to the next page, people would always say, before I got it, and I promise I'll make this easy to understand, GE should have been, if unregulated globalism makes sense, GE should have been the player that kicked serious ass, right? Because GE, and I can go back further than this, but I wanted to go back just 10 years, do a 10-year comparison, 2007 full year to 2017 full year. Obviously, we don't have 2018 full year done yet. So when you look at this and you say, with any business, and the stock is down at 728, it's not trading today. It may start trading in Asia shortly, but we'll see what happens tomorrow, whether GE continues down the expert ski slope to bankruptcy, basically.
Will PETA be upset that you've described the Asian stock market shortly? Sorry, that's a terrible joke.
Yes, it is. That's all right. So when we think about a business, your typical business, the old, call me stupid, but the smart way that businesses work is just like you talk about your subscribers going up. That's the essence of your top line, right? That's the number of the units of people who are participating in this venture of yours. You want that number to go up. If you were charging on YouTube, which you're not, you want to be able to expand the price per user. And you want to see revenues go up, right? Now, the correct way to think about the revenues of General Electric, in my view, is not the way they do it. Of course, little that they do is correct in my view. But they talk about the top line, the consolidated revenues. They had in 2007, they had a very large amount of debt in their capital business. And banks, financial services firms always present revenues, interest income, net of interest expense. So you should subtract out this finance interest, and you get to pro forma total net revenues. In 2007, it was $150 billion. They worked their asses off.
That's crazy.
Well, they worked their asses off. They paid billions of dollars of compensation and bonuses, tens of billions of dollars to the top people, the middle people. They didn't fund their pension plan. They didn't put money aside for environmental problems. And Jason, where did their revenues come in 10 years later?
Toilet, I believe.
118,947. So they went from 150 billion to 119 billion. Now that takes a lot of doing to go down in revenues. With all these people, that's a very bad sign. If you saw your Patreon go from wherever it is down to 200, you would not be happy. And you wouldn't need to hire McKinsey.
Something is wrong. You'd need to change something.
You don't need to hire McKinsey or Booz Allen or whatever, or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, or pay somebody off to say, well, I got a big problem. If my top line revenues are going, my profits ain't going to go up. Right? And if my profits don't go up, my cash flows don't go up, and I've got a tremendous amount of debt, I've got an appointment with a wall. It's not going to end well. So we look here back in 2000.
And Mexico's not going to pay for it.
And Mexico will not be paying for that wall. So then, most people talk about profits when they think about a business. With a company as complex as GE, you really have to look at cash flow because they do all these gimmicks to make profits look good or whatever. So cash flow is it's a very simple concept. At the end of a year, how much cash do you have? It's not not complicated. You don't have to do analysis of stocks and value assets or whatever. It's just how much freaking cash do I have in the bank, right? And so 150 billion they generate in revenues. Cash they generate 36.5 billion. In other words, for every dollar of revenue, they get 24 cents back in cash. That's pretty good, right?
Yeah.
Each additional sale, you get a quarter back.
Pretty good.
After taxes. That's very good. So after 10 years, how do they do? Declining revenues, 119 billion instead of 150. Their free cash flow went from 36.6 billion to 8.8. Now they're getting 7 cents in cash.
That's real bad.
For every dollar of sales. Now you think about that, in New York City, if you're a retail store and you sell something, you're going to pay almost 9 cents in sales tax off the top to the city and state for the privilege of operating your store in New York. And the business is going to get 7 cents. That's like communism. The governments are making more money off your business than you are in cash. It just doesn't make it. And this is their total results, right? So then you have to, I make it a little bit simpler, and I say, all right, let's look at the two pieces. Let's look at the industrial piece, and let's look at the finance piece. Let's take the finance piece first. In 2007, the finance piece had, net of interest, it had 49.4 million of revenue. It generated 30.3 billion of cash from operations. So for every dollar of net revenue in the finance business, they're generating 61 cents before capital expenditures and almost 50 cents after capital expenditures. Right? So that means for every dollar of finance revenue, they get almost 50 cents back. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah.
Right? But it skews the results. By lumping the cash from the finance business into the consolidated total, you're making the industrial business look a lot better than it truly is. And you're hiding that. The way they did it, they were hiding it. So back in 2007, you're at almost 50 billion in finance net revenues. What are you, Jason, in 2017? You're down to 6. 49.5 down to 5.9. I mean, these are people all along the way. Immelt's paying himself a lot of money. He really got bounced out for the episode where the board figured out he was so important, his security was so relevant to the continued prosperity of this liquidation exercise that on business trips he had to have not one Boeing 757 jet flying with him, he had to have 2 in case a GE engine broke and he couldn't use. I mean, it's just preposterous. This kind of behavior, when you have Bernie Sanders talk about the millionaires and billionaires and you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I have to join with those two and say, this is ridiculous. You cannot, as a board, keep these management people and these high-level management people enriching themselves, paying themselves $20 million a year with this type of a record, right? So consolidated is a decline in total revenues. Pro forma finance net revenues are like they're liquidating this business. But then you get to the industrial stuff. Industrial, 100.6 billion, and they're only, in the good times in 2007, they're getting 13 cents for every dollar, 13 cents of cash flow for every dollar of revenue in 2007, in the middle of the crisis. But by 2017, what are they getting? Their revenues have gone up, but their margins have gone down. That's even worse than liquidating. The last thing you want to do is take on more uneconomic sales, right? If somebody comes into the store and says, hey, I'll tell you what, I'll buy a whole bunch of stuff from you, but I want you to give it to me for no profit. You don't want to do that. Just say, you know what, I'll just wait. I don't need extra sales. I'll sell it for 13 cents. And even 13 cents of cash for $1 revenue, that bargain doesn't make sense. You can go to Texas and there's no sales tax. Right?
Texas has no sales tax?
I think I have that, or New Hampshire doesn't. I think Texas doesn't. They have some other taxes. There are states that don't have these type of taxes. And obviously GE is not paying sales tax. But typically states that have high sales tax have high other taxes, which they charge the employees and whatever. And so this record, for General Electric, which in 2007, I mean, it really should have, and prior to that, 99 and 88, we don't have that information readily at hand. It really should have been a business that if any business would flourish in unregulated globalism, GE should have. Now, maybe it's just simply a case of horrific management. It's possible. You could have a culture of like, instead of hiring good managers, we like to hire people who are boneheads, and we like to overpay them and then just pretend that we're in a business and just run around and have these presentations and meetings, and nobody really ever pays the consequences of it. So let's just go do all this, and we'll pretend that we're come up with jargon and whatever you call them, PowerPoint presentations, and we'll just keep doing that because that's what we do. But this has got to be studied. This GE, it was on from Welch's period, 81 to 99, 2000, or maybe 96, 97. It really did this. It was incredible what Welch did. I think it went off the rails. I haven't studied it in as much depth as I hope to in time, but I think when it made a commitment for an industrial business to get heavily into finance, competing against Goldman Sachs and banks around the world, it made a big, big error for which it's paying now. And it could well go bankrupt.
Wow. Kelly's telling us that Oregon has no sales tax. So.
Yeah, but it makes up for it.
In what?
Huge, massive income taxes, and Texas, I think, is the most. Texas and New Hampshire are two of the most interesting if you want to reroute an industrial concern. And
Chick Thread says Texas has no income tax.
Oh, so it does have sales tax. New Hampshire has no sales tax, that I know, and no income tax.
Well, that's pretty good. I think Nevada also has limited. I don't think there's property tax or something. They're just making so much money from the casinos that they.
So let's think about unregulated globalism before we get into some details here. If we can hit, I know you don't like to hit New York Times links, but if we hit the first one, this is right before the '96 election.
I subscribe to the New York Times just for you, Charles.
Oh, thank you. So this is Bill Sapphire, who is no longer with us, writing this article right before the election, recounting some of the many questionable relationships that the Clintons had with the Chinese. And remember, the Chinese and the Indonesians were basically Chinese interests operating in Indonesia, were in theory routing cash to the Clinton campaigns illegally, and for various reasons, to get good deals, to avoid being prosecuted.
Military secrets.
And here's the story. I mean, the New York Times, I know Sapphire was thought to be more right-leaning, and so maybe he was your token conservative at the New York Times. But nonetheless, it was definitely front of mind in 1996, as Bill was just finishing his first 4 years, running for his second 4 years, that, this, as we're in the middle, unregulated globalism's just budding. It's just coming to the fore. You'll see in a second that China and India were really not all that big as far as economies are concerned, but it was an issue of concern. If you go to the second slide, this is a book, I love the title of the second book there, yeah. This is not about Rodenstein. This is the second year of the rat, I suppose we should talk about it. But this Edward Timberlake book and William C. Triplett, I remember reading this book at the time. I think I have it somewhere. And again, if we're going to study this idea of collusion, which I'm all in for studying the degree to which foreign government cash and people, quasi-government interests, try to inculcate themselves into elections and interfere in elections, I'm all in for studying that. You've got to put it in context. You've got to go way back. When did this start? Okay, and why are we letting it? How does it really work? I don't think it's as simple. Maybe in the case of Clinton, it was as simple as some Indonesian guy who ran a Chinese restaurant in Little Rock, arranging for a whole bunch of people who had no income to give bags of cash to the Clintons, and people depositing in a local friendly bank. That strikes me as something that if you had any honor and any decency, you'd say, I ain't doing that. But you can't as easily do that after maybe it was done. So what do you do in lieu of taking bags of cash into some dusky office behind some Chinese restaurant in Little Rock? You open up what, Jason? you open up a slew of foundations around the world where instead of taking bags of cash, or maybe you could take bags of cash, you take wire transfers, you take checks, and you're operating around the world with no controls.
Charles, do you know about this guy, John Shally Cashfully?
I know who he is, yeah.
Yeah, he was the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I believe, and David Hawkins has spoken to me about him quite a bit. His father was a SS officer, Nazi.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, not his great-great-grandfather, not his grandfather, his father. So he
not a security risk at all, I wouldn't think.
Well, Clinton made him the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and later he became the CEO, I believe, of Boeing. And he went to China. Is that not correct?
I don't think Boeing, but maybe someone else.
He was something at Boeing. I'll have to look him up. But this guy is a guy for people to look at. I definitely would like to have you and David Hawkins compare notes at some time, because I think that would be quite
provided
useful.
It's not concerning Broadway shows or anything outside my area of expertise.
No.
So this is an interesting link here. You know, a lot less focus has been placed upon the corruption inside the United States involving Indian interests. Now, this is rich. Here we have Manmohan Singh, who I have been told is perhaps the most crooked human being on the planet. This Manmohan Singh was the finance minister of India who famously took it from a socialist country into India Inc. And he's now accusing Modi, this hard guy who's been really tough, who helped Gujarat state, a poor state in India. He was governor of that state. Here's this guy who has many major league questions surrounding his own corruption, daring to go public in India with the idea that Modi is corrupt. Now, in India, corruption is, there are many honorable people in India because there are many people in India, but there sadly is a lot of corruption in that country. And it's very tough to track that corruption because many people, Indian families are complicated, bigger families, brothers-in-law, sisters-in-law, all sorts of relations. And oftentimes it's very difficult to trace and see how bribes are paid, how favors are collected. Witness the guy who was listed as a $5 million donor to the Clinton Foundation, Amar Singh, I think was his name, who said, I don't have $5 million. I could never have given $5 million to the Clinton Foundation. But nonetheless, the Clinton Foundation, Peter Schweitzer has it in his book, and articles have been written about it.
Magically got $5 million?
Well, no, he gave $5 million supposedly to the Clinton Foundation. Now, we've talked about Rajat Gupta, but let's just hit that.
And just briefly, I misspoke. Shally Cashfully was elected to the board of directors.
Right, yeah, I don't think it was CEO. Anyway, this Felix Salmon is actually a very gifted writer. He's written a lot of good stuff, a young guy. And back at the time when the news first came out about Rajat Gupta, when he was indicted and all that kind of, Rajat Gupta was the first Indian managing partner of McKinsey, and we've talked about McKinsey before. Now, some look askance at McKinsey and say it's so big as a consulting firm, it has so many secrets. Every engagement they do, they get internal information about every company in an industry. That McKinsey, there are a lot of questions about McKinsey, right? And so,
why did they hire?
Chelsea Clinton.
Exactly.
In 2002, I believe it was. So one thing that did happen connecting the dots here is that when Rajat Gupta was head of McKinsey, he was the single most frequent visitor to the equivalent of the White House in India. I think they call it the Blue House. I may have that wrong. But, and he was very tied in with the Manmohan Singh government and got involved convincing first McKinsey to move their research center into New Delhi at a time when people weren't all that sure they wanted to have sensitive corporate secrets in India because the infrastructure wasn't developed and it wasn't really that advanced in terms of Western competitors. The economy was very small. It was still regulation prone. Corruption was very much of an issue. So when McKinsey did that, other multinational companies said, well, if McKinsey's going to entrust their corporate secrets to India, maybe we can too. And the first major company to do that and the chairman of the entity that was set up to do that, the first company was GE, and the chairman was Rajat Gupta.
Huh.
And so when GE said, okay, our small back office in India, we're going to let it be the back office for the entire multinational, and Rajat Gupta is going to be the chairman of it, you know, cynics like me would say, now wait a minute, what's really going on here? You know, you're convincing client information, sensitive industry information, now GE information, and all sorts of information will be housed inside India, where people are really smart, and you know, life is cheap. And if you want to figure out a way to bypass and hack into that information, or just to access that information, and you're connected to the government, you know, what better way than building a new economy than to just steal all the secrets of the competition? Now, I'm not saying that that was done with every company, but I don't think enough care was taken by our own government, particularly the Clinton administration, which in the period really 96 through 2000 was shifted the traditional relationship. We had long been friendly for I don't know what reason with Pakistan, or as Barack Obama would say, Pakistan, and we decided under Clinton to instead reject or downplay our relations with Pakistan and move to a closer ties with India. Hillary Clinton, of course, was in need for money to go win her Senate campaign, her Senate primary campaign, and she was accused of being the senator from Saree, S-A-R-E-E, in various, I remember in various funny articles, that she was catering the Indian American community to the Indian American community. And a lot of times these Indian Americans, yeah, they'll technically make the donation to a contribution to a campaign, but where does the money really come from? It's very complicated to trace that out.
Perhaps the catering included chicken vindaloo.
Exactly. Now, we've talked about this book, The Firm, but maybe we should hit it, put it up there again. This is a really good book that, because it's not quite as expensive as others, but we've profiled this book before. It tells the tale about McKinsey, but when I read it, I literally was almost laughing out loud, because virtually every case study relative to where Rajat Gupta had anything to do with it was a case study in disaster. You know, they talk about how he was in charge of Scandinavia, and then the entire Scandinavian group of countries all went bankrupt after they took his advice. And they talk about J.P. Morgan was a key client, and his team suggested, why don't you get out of banking? Which is, you know, I mean, I was just like, really?
What's
I don't drink.
Qualifications?
Well, he went to Harvard Business School, and again, I think this book says he was a Baker Scholar, which is top 5% of the class. And a lot of the Indian people who do go anywhere but come to Harvard Business School, that's easy stuff for anybody trained in engineering and science and math at a high level. And so many of the Indian classmates of mine were right at the top of the class. This guy couldn't get a job. He was turned down by McKinsey originally, and he was not a Baker Scholar. I checked at Harvard. I have an email that says, no, he was not a Baker Scholar.
So that's one of those things that somebody just says, and then people are like, oh, I guess he is.
Sounds good, right? I'm a Baker Scholar.
Hey, I don't even know what that is, but
I'm a croissant scholar, or whatever.
Exactly.
but no, it's a big deal, actually. It's very difficult to do, because when I went there, and I was 22 when I started, I didn't know the difference between a bank and a
You didn't
steel
know the
mill.
difference between a baker's scholar and a baker's dozen.
I wasn't even, I was just thinking about graduating. I was like, this is a bad, I walked in the first day and I'm looking around at all these people who are a lot older. There was one person who was twice my age. I'm thinking, or more than twice my age. I'm thinking, my God, I'll be real lucky to graduate.
At Harvard?
Business school, yeah. I was only 22. But anyway, that's a good book. Alana Goodman, who's an excellent journalist, has just started with the Washington Examiner. She wrote this piece. I worked with her on it. The number of felons, and these are chiefly Indian felons, that are tied to Bill Clinton through various charities, the Clinton Foundation and the American Indian Foundation, is just difficult to fathom. I mean, it's just like, you must not bother you terribly much to be associated with all these fraudsters. And this is an article that goes on and on and on, providing case study after case study. And so I only bring this up to say, here's the head of McKinsey, who gets Bill Clinton involved in the American India Foundation, who employs Chelsea at McKinsey and brags about it, and who also set something called Mind Spirit LLC up in 2001 and starts paying Bill and Hillary, reimbursing expenses and paying Bill millions of dollars without disclosing any of this, you know? And we keep going. Then we have The Billionaire's Apprentice. This is another one connected to the Clintons and the American India Foundation. This gentleman, and this book is a long book, but it's very well done, came out right after I started writing the articles about the Clinton Foundation. The intersection of crooks mentioned in this book with the American India Foundation, with the Clinton Foundation, with the Clintons themselves, it's almost a perfect match. That's why I came up with Ortel's First Law. You just
From this book.
From this and the other books, just saying, you know, it was just mind-numbing. Anytime I came up with a name in one of these books, I'd punch it in with the word fraud and Clinton. And there'd be all these connections. It just makes this research that simple. And this is really a startling descent from grace. I mean, this Rajat Gupta, I remember hearing about him, but not really thinking much about him. And I'm amazed that he could do so many things at once. Managing partner of McKinsey, on the board of Goldman Sachs, on the board of American Airlines, on the board of Procter & Gamble, all these charities, running around the world nonstop, you know, and
it's somewhat implausible, right? I mean, any of those things should occupy a considerable amount of your time.
Right. And so we don't need to put, well, maybe we'll for the hell of it, put Peter Schweitzer's book up. We don't really give Peter enough credit, and I like to give him a lot of credit. I mean, his book that came out, this is the paperback version, the hardback came out in 2015, made the essential case. I mean, his analysis was given to the New York Times. They found nothing wrong in what Peter did. They published all sorts of stories. There were Fox videos about it, a movie about it.
Yeah.
This is a book, you know, books like this I like to go back and reread when I know more information. But it was Peter who, among other things, drew my attention to Laureate, something I knew nothing about until I read about it in Peter's book. And there's just, you know, there's so much evidence of fraud and corruption just in this book alone. Forget all the work we've done. Just this book alone is enough to say, you know, why hasn't the FBI and the Department of Justice and the IRS, why haven't they jumped all over this thing and put us all out of the misery we've been through trying to explain this? And we said before that if you want to really trace out all these conflicts, if you go back into, you hit the second link here, this is the Clinton Global Initiative Commitments to Action. And if you go down the page a little bit, there's a little line here for those in the crowd who want to have fun doing work. You go down a little bit further, I think, even further, all the way down there. Search all commitments to action. At the very bottom there, you hit that arrow, and you get to a landing page after you get, they're asking, this is a solicitation. They're soliciting on our program here, illegally, okay? You hit the X button because we're not going to, and you could just punch in whatever you want, and there's something like 3,000 different commitments to action.
What should we put in?
Well, we're going to move along because we've done this before.
Right.
But yeah, the 3,600 commitments to action. And then we have the infamous Clinton Inc. Doug Band memo, which this is in CNBC. There are different ways to get the Band memo. If we hit released by WikiLeaks, the first blue link there, you get the Band memo and you hit the attachment, and this is the final version. There's several versions of this memo actually in WikiLeaks, but it should come up.
It's going to launch Microsoft Word here.
But this is a memo we've harshed on in the past. Now, Doug Band is, in theory, a lawyer in good standing. I believe a member of the bar in Florida. And look at this. This is sent November 16th, 2011 to Bill Clinton, who it alleges in this memo was the Clinton Foundation founder. Well, he's never been in any legal documents concerning that. Chelsea Clinton, who just had joined the board, Terry McAuliffe, Bruce Lee. John Podesta had no close relationship to the to the Clinton Foundation. But you read this is just, it is an embarrassing confession of illegal private gain, enormment, illegal solicitation, fraud, false disclosures, undisclosed related party transactions, material, I just go on and on and on.
But now they're turning it into a crime to have even spoken to Julian Assange.
Right, and here we say, in 2001, 2001, after Terry McAuliffe raised the initial $100 million to build the library. In 2001, there was no money pledged on there were no financial accounts in 2001. I think the first set of financial accounts were put together in 2002. And the argument that they needed another 100 million is just not supported by any facts. A lease was signed March 1st, 2002, where it said the cost of the damn thing was going to be 100 million. So, this is just, to me, about the stupidest memo I've ever seen anybody write, who wanted to remain in business. And somehow, this fellow, Doug Band, he's buying, David Rockefeller's mansion for 20 million. He just went into the Lynx Club, which is extremely difficult to get into that club. And he's built this business, Teneo, which is in theory a consulting, an investment bank, an investment management firm, but in practice, I don't know if anybody serious who continues to work with this firm. And you can't build up such an entity while you're also creating a charity. So we don't need to hit these two links, but if you want to see the corruption and if you want to see
train wreck in slow motion.
The source for the tables we're now going to do is in those two links. Let's not pull them up. Let's just go right to the meat. All right. So we're going to go, rather than go, and obviously we wouldn't have time to go through 200 countries, we're just going to go through 5. Okay? And we're going to do this pretty quickly. Instead of talking about GDP, we're going to make this really simple. Everyone understands the idea of how many people live in your country, right? So according to these statistics, in 1988, China had 1.1 billion, then 1.3, and 1.4 by 2016. So you have a growing population, a large growing population. This is the largest country by population in the world. But the consumption, and consumption is a very simple concept. That's what all the money you spend, basically, to live. The consumption was only $253 billion, right? So less than $1,000 per person. In 1988. China, in summary, let's put this in a very complex set of economic terms, was dirt effing poor. It had, for over 1 billion people, lived on less than $250 a year.
A year?
A year. That's not so good. That's bad, right? And even as you move along here by 2016, that's the most recent year, there's still, the entire population's only making about $3,000 a year per person. So it's not a very rich country. Yes, there are slices of it that are very rich in Hong Kong and Shanghai, other places. Sure, there are elites that are rich. But to the extent the elites are rich in China, the poor are even poorer, right? Then you look at the amount of money invested. 162 billion, 367 billion, 2 trillion, almost $5 trillion in 2016. We're going to show you that these amounts of money of investing are absurdly high and probably crooked as hell. Do not make any sense. If you're primarily marketing inside your country, right, why would you spend 4.9 trillion to serve a market that only
has $300?
Oh, yeah, it makes $3,000 a year, and only in total that market is $4.4 trillion. It just doesn't make sense. You can't make the investment pay off. Unless what you think you're going to do is create these mega factories and drive the rest of the world out of business, and make up for what you're not doing inside the country by exporting the hell out of the country.
I mean, isn't that what they plan?
Well, I'm going to show you the dimensions of how stupid this is. So instead of looking at these in big, big numbers, what I'm doing here is indexing them. I'm saying, whatever the amount is in 1988, that's the base. And so if the population goes from 1.1 billion in 1998 to 1.3 billion, it's up 12%. It's 12% higher. Cumulatively, 19% higher. Cumulatively, 24% higher. But look at how much household consumption is up. Starts at 100, it's 85% higher. It's 6.6 times. It's 17.4 times. Investment is ballooning, 100, 225, 12 times higher, 30 times higher.
Wow.
Okay? And exports are going from 100, 4 times higher, 30 times higher, 43 times higher.
Wow.
So in essence, this is in theory an export-led model. What they're doing is they're saying, you know, rather than try to cater to the very poor people inside our country, we're just going to make stuff in China, probably not abiding by international norms for environmental and the way we take care of workers and taxes and all that.
Nets on the windows.
Yeah, exactly. And one way to simply think about it is the relationship between the local market, the amount of money we spend each year, and the purchases in the economy, 64%, 78%. By 2008, we are investing 120% of the total revenues, internal revenues of our people inside China. It's an absurdly high. You cannot make that investment level make a decent rate of return. And why would anybody do that? It's just like the Clinton Foundation. What you would do, is you would say the Clinton Foundation complex cost 165 million. In reality, it only cost 83, and you would steal the difference. You get a crooked accountant to say, yeah, we invested 4.9 trillion inside the country. The reality, they may have invested 1.5 trillion that year, and you get crooked accountants to write up books that said, yeah, that factory over there, we spent 300 billion on that, when in reality you spent, 100 billion. And so this is just surface level, very suspicious. The amount that they're exporting, by 2008, their exports are 90% of the local consumption. Okay? Very, very suspicious when you look at these numbers. And we're going to take you country by country, and then we're going to compare them. The key numbers will compare them. So you don't have to remember any of these numbers or write anything down. These slides, by the way, are all accessible or will be accessible online. In Japan, we start with the population. If the population is not growing, it's tough to have revenues increase, right? And worse, the reason the population is not growing is that it's aging. So they're not having babies.
Saving more.
Well, they're not having babies. The older people are not spending money. And so when you go from a robustly growing economy where people are having more than 2 children and where they're creative and inventive and optimistic and they're thinking about living, providing a better life to the next generation, you have a robust economy. When you make a decision at top line, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to stay relatively constant. After almost 30 years, the Japanese population is only 3% higher than it was in 1988. And bear in mind, in 1988, the Japanese thought they were going to take over the world. They were
buying Rockefeller Center,
doing whatever. And you see the household consumption, this market I was telling you about, it's on 1.6 to 2.2 to almost 2.9. So, but between 2008 and 2016, the household consumption, the revenues are down.
Why is that?
Well, because the population's aging and people aren't buying stuff. And so when you're
what about Fukushima?
That's also an issue before 2016.
There's probably less people having kids because the birth defects are up and all that.
It could be, but after China, Japan is the largest economy. I think it's the largest economy after China. So the U.S. is 1, China's 2, Japan is 3 now.
Wow.
And so when you start thinking, and forget the globalist approach, look at the biggest pieces of any problem, understand those. And you may see something by just studying 5 countries that you're going to miss by looking at an amalgam of 200 countries, many of which are small and whose results don't matter to the global piece. So the household consumption market is not growing very quickly by comparison to China. Investment market, you see that investment's only 1.2 trillion 2008, 2016, whereas China is investing 5 trillion. Okay? And exports, you see, go from 300 up to 800 billion. Now look at the very bottom. These are ratios that I think are interesting. At the very bottom, we see that investment, the amount of money they spend per year on total investment, is at the beginning, at the peak, when they're really blowing money, buying Rockefeller Center, doing all sorts of crazy stuff, 62% of consumption, declining to 42%. And exports are 19% of consumption in this year in 88, when everyone was concerned in 88 that Japanese are flooding the world market with exports. But their exports were really only 19%, roughly a fifth of the consumption inside the country. So you can't say fairly that the the Japanese were as aggressive as the Chinese now are, trying to flood the world market with their exports and deny access to the internal market to people like American manufacturers and Western European manufacturers who want to pierce into China.
Well, I wonder how much manufacturing is actually happening in Japan now, because I mean, stuff like Sony TVs and everything, this type of thing is all being made in South Korea and China, right?
They still have a fair amount, you're right. So if we go through this to the next one, we'll bring you, I believe, Germany. Now, once again, Germany has this same issue of a slow-growing population, 78 million up to just 81.9. So cumulatively, this row here, it's only up 5% cumulatively after 28 years.
Wow.
I mean, that's basically no growth. And a lot of the growth, Japan does not allow immigrants.
At all?
Well, not really, no.
James Corbett lives there.
Is he still alive?
James Corbett? I think so. I was watching him just the other day.
But is he a Japanese nationalist? I mean, Japanese national?
I think he's Canadian or something, or maybe American, and he's like 40-something or 50.
You can live there, but you can't become a Japanese national that easily.
Yeah,
so in Germany, though, of course, Angela Merkel said, we're going to let in 1 million immigrants in a year, which is why she's going to get kicked out of office, because that didn't work very well. But so when you look at...
Has she heard of Sweden?
Yeah. But you look at these numbers include, many years of allowing immigrants who may not necessarily assimilate into Germany, but nonetheless, the total population has not grown. And again, inside Germany, if your population isn't growing, then it's very tough to assume that you're going to have growing sales inside your home market. Household consumption, much smaller than the US. Investment, much smaller than Japan and way smaller than China. But look at this exports. Exports went from 200, this one here, 295.
Cars.
Yeah, 295 billion in 1988 up to 1.6 trillion in 2016, or up 5 times.
Wow.
Right, so, and then you look at these bottom lines here, inside Germany, they're not over-investing the way Chinese are, but they're very reliant on exports. 37% of local household, local sales were exports, but 87% by 2016. So now you know why China's all in for globalism, Germany's all in for globalism, because they don't have an internal market big enough to support their outsized factories and their ambitions. They're all for promoting unregulated globalism. China, because they feel they have the largest population in the world, almost a quarter, 20% anyway, they should have a seat at the globalist table. Germany, because they're a tiny country, much smaller, they're a quarter the size of the United States in population, and as we'll show you in a minute, very small when it comes to the size of the economy. Of course they want to control Europe. It's been a long-standing ambition of the Germans, actually, going back. It hasn't worked so well.
Well, has the fall of the Berlin Wall, it's something we don't hear that much about in the mainstream news in the United States anymore, but it looks like it maybe really helped manufacturing and export and that kind of stuff?
In theory it did, yeah. In theory it did, but at what cost? So then we go to India, which would be the next of the 5, last of the 5. And you look again at the size of the population.
Lots.
Big and growing faster than any of the other countries we mentioned. So that's a problem, because the resources in India, arable land, clean water, these are big problems in India. It's a dry country in terms of, a lot of the country is arid, and this population is growing out of control. Back in 88, it was still socialist. 98, it was only barely coming out of socialism. 2008, it still wasn't, it was a success story, but still a tiny market. Even today, in 2016, it's only 1.3 trillion for 1.3 trillion people. So it's $1,000 of purchases per year. That's $80-odd a month. I mean, you are not talking about, to the mass of the Indian market yet, you're not talking about selling them televisions and computers. Well, yeah, the elite But the overwhelming mass, they're not quite at a stage of development where we should be that optimistic about them. And besides, they haven't invested enough yet to really build out the infrastructure. I mean, look at this. 86 billion only in 1988 in total investment. That's all housing, new housing, all industrial plants, everything. And even by 2016, only 686 billion. It's still an underdeveloped economy, very underdeveloped, with the most rapidly growing population of these, consequential countries. We have left out France, which is burning, hopefully not completely down. We've left out the UK, which is racked by Brexit concerns. There are not that many economies in the world that have household consumption markets of $1 trillion a year. Okay, and $1 trillion is a lot of money. But a market of $1 trillion in India that has a population of 1.3 billion is very different than a market that approaches $1 trillion in Australia that might have 26, or whatever the number is in Australia, million, as opposed to 1.3 billion people. Very different markets. So let's look a little bit at the US. Now, the US is a big market in terms of population. It's the third, I think it's the third largest in the world in population. We're growing, our population is growing at a much slower rate than India's. It's only up 30% in 28 years. But look at the size of our household consumption market. 3.4 trillion up to $12.9 trillion per year.
Wow.
Okay, we spend a lot of money in this country on living. And we're able to do that because people are quite willing to lend money to the American consumer, whether mortgages, student loans, and to American businesses. They're willing to do that so long as this country is viewed as less corrupt, has a system of law and order, we're responsible. But the second you go, economics, world economics is a long, centuries of history of going from boom to bust. People get enamored about a concept, they throw money at it, they throw too much money at it, and there's a structural crisis and it bombs, and then suddenly you're Venezuela and you can't, or Zimbabwe or whatever, and you can't, or at various moments in time, the Soviet Union, go way back to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There have been spectacular booms and busts of many large empires going back through the history, and we do not want to go through the kind of bust that could happen if we don't get our act together and stop listening to economically illiterate people like Ocasio-Cortez, Hillary Clinton, and others. So our household consumption market is vast. We are investing a lot less per year relative to the size of our market than China is. Our exports are big, but they're tiny compared to the size of our internal market. So when you go down to the bottom of this page, Jason, you look at the ratios I was talking about before. We only invest 30 cents in capital for each dollar of consumption or sales in the whole internal sales of the entire country. In other words, that 3.7 trillion that we're spending over there in investment, a lot of that is on residential construction. So the amount of money that we invest in businesses is really, it's probably 15 cents on the dollar of revenue, 12 cents on the dollar of revenue. And here's China investing, more than 100 cents on a dollar relative to their local
But it doesn't
market.
really tell you anything. I mean, like we've heard about these gigantic shopping malls and cities in China that are built and nobody lives in them.
Well, that's the point. So
That counts as investment, right?
exactly, it's malinvestment. I think China, and Gordon Chang is a friend who's written and is always on television talking about this, and people are beginning to listen to him. We have a problem in this country with too much debt, but we have for the moment a large market. People do buy goods and services. Things are looking better in the United States than they have for many, many years. Let's look at comparing a few key metrics. Let's go to the next page. Now, we look at population, and it gives you a sense, if we're going to move to a one person, one vote globalist government, how's the United States going to do? Not too well. China's up at 1.4 billion, India's 1.3 billion. You see the 2016 column.
Yeah.
That's 2.7 billion people, and we're down at 325. if China and India get together in whatever globalist government we're going to have,
Not good.
we won't even have minority votes. I mean, if there's the equivalent of a Security Council, we'll have nothing to say. I mean, so these Looney Tunes who want to eliminate borders and say, let's move to reject the Constitution and let's have unregulated globalism, why are they doing that? They're in on the corruption game, in my view. They want to do, if you're in with the Chinese elites or the Indian elites or the German elites, and you've got a way of cobbling together some gigantic project financed by some multilateral institution, you put no money down and walk away with the potential of making $500 million or $1 billion, yeah, that can make sense if you're never going to get caught. But you don't do that at the cost of surrendering your sovereignty. I mean, there is no global government or your regional government that makes any damn sense at all, that has taxing power, has a military, that has a settled sense of law. We should focus on the United States. It's our home market. It's the biggest market in the world. There is room to make this market better for all of us, disrupt government the way big companies have been disrupted, bring the cost of delivering government services down, give more value, for every dollar of taxpayer spending, make it be worth a lot more to people across the line, especially the poorest among us. Then you look at the size of household consumption. The biggest population, 4.4. Second biggest, 1.3. We're 12.9. We're so out. That's like roughly, we're $40,000 a person roughly. China's 3,000. India's 1,000.
Wow.
These are very different markets, right? And you can't sell to a global average. You can't design some factory in China to sell based on the assumption that the global market is gigantic because it includes the United States. It drives up the averages. You got to look at it nation by nation by nation. So if we go to the next page. Again, here we put together the population growth, cumulative growth rates. You see China's growing, India's the fastest growing, we're growing faster than China. But Japan and Germany fundamentally are not growing. China's very reliant on exports. India is somewhat reliant. We're not reliant at all. The average American business, less than 20%, probably 15% of the average American business is export oriented. Which means that if we got more interested in exporting and other countries were less protective, there's a lot of potential for US-based businesses to grow on the international market. And that's why I think Donald Trump does wield the upper hand in these trade negotiations. You can't sit there in China and say, well, we don't want this gigantic US market. We'll just focus on our tiny little, market here that's underdeveloped, and we'll just get frozen out of the US market. Whereas dreams of making money in China are just that, they're dreams. There's little evidence that the big American companies are minting money on their operations in China. They may, the Bechtels, the construction and engineering firms, some of the banks, may be making fees and this and that, but there's little evidence to suggest so far that businesses that go through the drill of investing lots of money to be in China are actually sending cash dividends back home from their activities in China that are all meaningful to any of these piles of companies.
I got an email from someone in South Africa today that said that they're unable to participate in Patreon or PayPal. So
yeah,
it's difficult to export, crowdsource the truth. And with regard to China, when I was leaving Hollywood in 2013, there was a big ramp up. They were talking about how 3D movie theaters were being built in China, and I was negotiating with a couple of different Chinese companies about going to China to. It was a very, very difficult negotiation in terms of getting to where's the part of this contract that talks about how much money I'm going to get. They would say, oh no, don't worry about that. Just sign the contract and we'll work that out when you get to China.
Right.
And much bigger companies than 21st Century 3D in subsequent years have pulled out of China because they weren't getting paid.
Right. Exactly. And one cannot think carefully enough about how much better quality of life is focusing on getting your home base correct and selling as much as possible as you can inside the country inside the state inside the city before you greatly complicate your business by opening another office inside your country and God forbid in another country. You cannot overstate how much risk is involved doing that. And to the extent you want to, instead of export into a foreign place, to the extent you want to go into a foreign country, you better make sure you have the right partner. You better make sure that you've studied the thing carefully. You better have confidence that the system of laws will remain intact over the life of your investment. You start going through and thinking about it. Of course, business development people want to fly around the world throwing your money out of an airplane, as a client of mine once said, and then reporting back from this fancy place in the Alps skiing in between a business meeting and this fancy place in Asia at the beach or whatever. The potential is great. Give me more money that I can throw out of the airplane.
Right.
But when you start having your senior executives, who after all, everyone's human, it's not easy to be the person who's the top decision maker, trying to fly around the world and meet all these important customers, and then also talk to your finance people, and make sure that the business that you're operating actually is working. It's just really tough to do that. Witness what happened to GE. It hit the Great Wall of GE, right? So then we look at the final slide here, and give you a sense. Again, we show at the top the population growth rates. These are rough proxies in my mind for revenue increases that should be possible over long periods of time. You should be able to at least grow your revenues in line with population. If you can't do that, something's probably wrong. If your population's changing, if your population's going from on average making 3,000 a year to making 10, to making 25, you may have explosive growth inside a country. But if it's staying where it is, you should just be in line with population growth plus maybe in local inflation. But you don't want to be as China is. Look at China up here. In 2008, 2016, they're spending 120% of their total national revenue, sales potential, on capital investment inside the country. That's just crazy. Cities. That's crazy, right? And I think it is. I think it is projects. They'll say, it's just like the Clinton Foundation in Little Rock. They'll say it cost $165 million. In this case, it would be $1.65 trillion or $5 trillion on average. But the reality is, let's say it cost $2 trillion and $3 trillion is stolen. And that's simply put. The way it's stolen is you have markup invoices and you say stuff costs a lot more, and the difference is just routed outside the country, whether by cash or whatever. I think there is the biggest bubble ever built in China, and it's waiting to come falling down. And we've done a show before about the magnitude. It's well above 20 trillion in investment going from 2007 to 2016.
Biggest bubble ever built.
Exactly. Bubblicious, not so much.
Bubba.
Yes, speaking of Bubba, yeah. So the United States, we're actually spending the most economically, and that figure for the United States includes the speculative residential bubble that has been built again since 2008. This money, total investment that we cite for US, includes these new office towers you see and residential towers all over Manhattan, big cities everywhere.
Tallest building in the city now is a residential tower.
Where is that one? Up in 57th?
57th or something like that.
So if we can, Jason...
It's skinny too.
Yeah. Let's just go back, if we may, to the GE slide. Now that we've been through these figures, just reviewing the five largest economies in the world.
Which one was that?
That's the ones, probably 5, maybe. Yeah, here we go. Yeah, page 5. So again, now that we've been through this and we've shown you that the US market's interesting, but China may not have been the smartest place to play, and some of these other markets where GE is very big, Japan, India, Germany, are all challenged. When we think that GE is operating, I believe when I looked at it last, in 120 nations, okay? You just thinking about the 5 big markets and the complexities of those, how in the heck is anybody thinking clearly at General Electric about a business spread to the wind in all these different disciplines and then all these different geographies with all the different legal issues and the fact that it has too much debt? How can you explain what they're doing?
Fixing the airplane engines would require them to be in a lot of different countries.
Right. I mean, they should have called the damn thing Specific Electric or Specific something. But
General Everything is what GE stands for.
Right. So I just wanted to end on this slide because there is a possibility that General Electric will have some sort of white knight, that somebody will look at this thing and say, General Electric the stock used to be worth $400 billion. Now it's $70 billion. So maybe I should buy some. I mean, an idiot wrote an article a couple of days ago saying, here's why I've doubled my investment in GE, and the stock promptly went down a whole bunch. I think the more likely scenario for GE, and again, I'm not giving financial advice, I'm just commenting, is that as we go through this 2018 year end, we've got the year end in December coming, that's when people are going to have to put their books together. We already know that GE's industrial and finance results, because many of them are energy-based projects, are really in big trouble because the energy price is low, it's fallen precipitously. People are going to value any energy-related asset, are going to say, wait a minute, whatever value we had last year, we've got to mark it down. GE has a lot of debt. It has little credibility yet. It has a new manager who's not exactly making a good impression in my mind yet. Culpability. You look at the succession of people. They like to pick people with bad names.
Welch.
Jack, I welch on deals. Jeff, I melt shareholder value. And Larry, I'm culpable, but I don't want to be. I mean, I think this is becoming a punching bag here, and it's going to be the brave soul who steps into the plate and leaps into the breach here and says, I want this, I'm all in, other than somebody like MBS, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, who's got a gigantic sovereign wealth fund, who could look at this and say, or I'll be the white knight. I'll come in here, I'll distract from the fact that I just murdered somebody maybe, and I'll sign up and give GE 25 billion or 50 billion, and I'll rescue GE the same way Prince Waleed, if you remember, rescued Citibank in the 90s, and when was it global, his reputation was made by that one act. So people will notice that, and somebody with too much money and not enough common sense might be lured into taking 25 billion, 33 billion, 35 billion out of a sovereign wealth fund that's not really his or her money for the global fame that you get temporarily. I'm the insightful, far-looking, sustainable, this whatsoever, who's going to take this pig and fix it. Short of that, I think you could have people around this, the board members, you could have lawyers, you could have people say, you know what, third time is not a charm here. I mean, we had a big problem with GE when Jack Welch fixed it in 81, when a high energy price, high inflation, political turmoil period. Now, in 2007, 8, 9, it nearly went under. Not so much this time. Maybe it should go under. Maybe that's a way of clearing out the underbrush. So this presentation today was more to get us into thinking about globalism. Doesn't really make that much sense on the numbers. Clinton Foundation, supposed to be a Little Rock-based presidential records archive, suddenly, instead of declaring that it raised $100 million for a $100 million project, now it's roughly raised $3 billion. What did it do with the other $2.9 billion? Is that really the amount of money that it took? Was it really nothing more than just a slush fund? Sure looks like that to me. And more on that in the next several days.
You know, Charles, just briefly back to MBS and Khashoggi that you were talking about there. Why was there not a CIA report on the death of Michael Hastings or the death of Vince Foster? It seems...
Well, it would have been FBI, but...
But why is the CIA... The FBI didn't investigate Vince Foster's death. It was the Fort Marcy Park Police. Why don't they go get the park rangers to investigate the death of Jamal Khashoggi?
Or Truman the Tiger.
Truman the Tiger could investigate. He's got an investigative body for sure. Well, Charles, thank you very much for yet another amazing presentation. I want to thank all of our generous Patreon sponsors who keep the show coming back every day. If you're watching right now, we've had over 1,100 people watching most of the time. Some of those people should consider becoming sponsors on patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. The show cannot continue without our generous Patreon sponsors. And I'm sure everyone, Charles, will be looking forward to seeing you again on Sunday. We'll have to prepare yet another exciting movie-based theme for that. And I'll see everybody tomorrow. You know, tomorrow, Charles, is Thursday, and of course we've got the intelligence assessment with Kevin Shipp. I think Kevin's going to have some information to share with us about H.W. Bush, everybody's least favorite CIA stooge, who was in there for a long, long time. And of course, that show is available only on Patreon, so people should become sponsors. And I will see you very soon, Charles. I hope it gets dark now, very early, so we're dark here in New York. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you tomorrow.